First of all, thank you for the invitation to be here, and also just let you know what I'm going to be talking about. What I'm going to be talking about is what's stopping us from eating better. Now, I'm calling today from Texas, where we have climate change originated power cuts in our winter storms, and to keep themselves warm, our politicians often burn copies of the Eat Lancet report. This isn't really the place to look for sort of cutting edge ideas around how to transform the food system. Nonetheless, what I want to do is suggest that there are some historical examples that we could turn to. I also wanted to do this by sort of just going through another sort of a troubling moment that we're in at the moment, which is the rise of AI. So what I'm going to do is try and explain how we can eat better, and what's stopping us from eating better, by using a series of images mostly generated by artificial intelligence. So let's kick off. With let's see if the next button works for me here. It does. So I asked the Mid-Journey AI to generate a picture of the industrial food system, and it did this beautifully. You can't really read what's on the packages, but you can tell that this is a dead end. And this is, I mean, we've heard in this session a number of arguments for why it is that we're eating badly right now. The industrial food system has a chokehold not only on generations of tastes, as Corinna mentioned, but also, in terms of government policy, as Marco was covering. So the industrial food system is part of the problem. And I worry that, in many ways, the industrial food system is sort of like a Bond villain. And this is the story that we have of the industrial food system really does need to point the finger directly at the food industry and at the capitalist food industry as an agent of consolidation, of exploitation, and of great suffering. And yet we're told that actually what we need to do is trust some of these companies to do the right thing, because these companies have immense resources at their disposal. If only we can partner with them, they can deploy those resources not for bad but for good, and we could end up with an image like this instead of a Bond villain. We could have a Disney movie ending. It would be lovely. And the problem with that is something that even AI can clock. Because when you try and fuse these two things, when you try and have a Bond movie that's been going on for centuries and try to have a Disney ending, then, as you can see in the image, things start looking a little uncanny. Either the villain turns out not to have been so bad, and you can see it looks a little sweeter now in the picture, or the Disney animals start looking a bit more sinister. But either way, this isn't a great outcome. And I don't believe that partnering with food giants is going to lead to a happy outcome. And Exhibit A for me comes from British history. So let's go to a very an absolutely not AI generated picture. This is Turner's picture of it's called the slave ship. He painted it in the mid 1800s. But it's referring to a real incident that happened in 1781. It's an incident that you may have heard of. If you haven't, it's quite horrific. It involves the real slave ship called Zong. It was traveling from Africa, and it stopped at St. Thomas. It was heading to the island of Jamaica, which was a lucrative market for the traffic in enslaved people. The captain of the Zong was nearing Jamaica, and then for some reason turned away. And when it became clear to him that he'd missed Jamaica, and that the people aboard his ship, whose lives he was about to traffic in, were starting to fall ill, the Captain Collingwood, made a cold calculation. He decided that of the 740 enslaved Africans who were on board, a number needed to be thrown overboard in order to claim the insurance money. And so 133 Africans were thrown overboard, And then when the ship finally docked, the Zong's marine insurance policy was called upon to compensate the slave owners for their lost property. Initially, the court, the insurers refused to pay, but in the end, the court case brought for became a sort of a cause célèbre in the UK when it became clear that actually the discussion in the court case was, in the words of the presiding judge, really a question about whether humans could be treated as if they were horses. Now, that moment in British history caused, quite understandably, a great deal of revulsion. And there were moves to abolish slavery, but there were also moves by certain folk to say, look, don't get involved in this abolition debate. It's too difficult. It's just, it involves activists going around peacocking and posturing, when really what we need to be doing is partnering, and also what we need to be doing is engaging in individual acts of abnegation. And one of the people who suggested that was Samuel Taylor Coleridge. And he said this. I'm going to read this out using my best Samuel Taylor Coleridge voice. And I imagine he didn't sound like, had all the people who petitioned. I imagine he's more like, had all the people who petitioned for the abolition of this execrable commerce, instead of bustling about and showing off with all the vanity of pretended sensibility, simply left off the use of sugar and rum, it is demonstrable that the slave merchants and planters must either have applied to Parliament for the abolition of the slave trade, or have suffered the West India trade altogether to perish, a consummation most devoutly to be wished. Because Samuel Taylor Coleridge was, in fact, a romantic. He believed that by refraining from consuming things that have been that were part of this evil food system, the food system itself might change. And sugar was really, sugar and rum were the key commodities that at that time involved enslaved people's labor. There were others, though. Still, point being that it's possible to imagine a food system, says Samuel Taylor Coleridge, that doesn't involve all this exploitation, if only we don't eat the things that they produce. And the merchants of the food system are quite happy about that, because you even have things like this appearing on the scene. The East India, it says this is a bowl from the East India Company. East India sugar, not made by slaves. The East India Company, one of the largest corporations ever to be on the face of the earth, led the charge in colonizing vast tracts of the earth. But imagine this: slavery free. It's like a little label that you find on your sugar. It's just this is the kind of sort of consumer activism that allowed these corporations to continue doing what they did. And in fact, we have in 1807 the British abolition of slavery, which the historian Eric Williams observes. With all the celebration around the end of slavery, it seems like Britain almost just introduced slavery solely for the pleasure of abolishing it. But if you look at this document, the abolition of slavery did involve the kind of compromise that Corinna was mentioning earlier on. But sadly, that kind of compromise involved a vast budget, £200 million, $1 billion today, about half the national budget. But the compromise involved compensating slaveholders with that money. And while that, I think we need to talk about the terrain in which we engage in compromise. I think I'm agreeing with Corinna that ultimately, when we have a transformation of the food system, it will involve some sort of give and take. But let's not give too much. And the problem with many of the approaches that we have at the moment when thinking about the food system is that we fail to recognize adequately who the bad guys are and what they're, we give them too much credence for their capacity to change. For instance, some of the greatest profiteers from the trade in enslaved people involved were, for example, the Barclay brothers. These are good Quaker men who are nonetheless part of international cartels that involved enslaving people. And even though slavery had been abolished in the UK, they were quite happy to invest vast amounts of money in parts of the world where sugar was produced with the labor of enslaved people, Cuba and Brazil in particular, and very happy to truck and barter in the product of enslaved labor, particularly from here in the United States, from here in Texas, Texas, the state that fought for slavery twice. And I mean, the commodity that that involved the labor of enslaved people here, cotton, is something that, again, Barclays Bank and a range of financiers had no trouble trading back and forth to the UK. And the UK was quite happy to drop tariffs on products that involved the labor of enslaved people down to the same as non-enslaved people. That's how seriously the compromise was taken. And really, the serious transformation around the end of slavery only happened here in Texas very briefly with the idea of 40 acres and a mule. Only through a crisis facing the capitalists who engaged in this kind of unconscionable behavior, and only through land reform, and only through new ways of farming and new people farming on with capital that they had been denied their entire lives, was it possible to imagine a transformed food system. So I think we need to be thinking much more seriously about what the transformation ahead of us needs to involve. We do need to be thinking about land reform, because if we don't, then our Bond villains are quite happy to put out press releases celebrating their virtues. Barclays, I mean, I don't want to pick on Barclays, but we should pick on Barclays because here are people who are offering visions of commitments against deforestation, zero tolerance approach to corruption, and yet they're lending vast amounts of money to JBS, the largest meat processor in the world, and one that's demonstrably a problem. So, what do our AI overlords make of this? Well, I mean, I think it's important for us to recognize that we need to seize we need to make things difficult for capitalists, and that means doing things like going on strike. And creating crises that increase our bargaining power, so that the compromises that we get to are compromises that favor us rather than the holders of capital. Uh, but that's I mean I think it's interesting when I was thinking, well, what does a strike on behalf of that involves compassion for animals look like? Well, the Mid-Journey AI gave me this, which I thought was very interesting. Here we are, sort of four panels of animals clearly upset about something, and I thought, well, let's the way it works with Midjourney is you get to pick a particular one of these as a favorite, and you get to upscale it. So I said, well, let's upscale number 3, and what we got was this, which I thought was fascinating, because we hear a lot about AIs hallucinating. And what it did in upscaling was actually insert a person amid these animals. And I think that's interesting for a number of reasons. I mean, first of all, remember that this is an AI that's trained on journalists' views on what gets published about strikes, and it is about workers, not really about animals, but it is about a frontline view of a picket line. But this is where I want to end, because in fact, I've never seen a picket line like this, and neither have you. But the kinds of picket line that I'm excited about involves training our vision in a different way. And in particular, training our vision on pictures like this, where we're not in front of the picket line, we're on it. The only way that we get to make change is not by being passive in trying to renegotiate the boundaries of what is acceptable and not acceptable in the food system, but by being participants in that radical transformation. And that's not something that AI has been trained on, because there are far fewer of these pictures in the public domain, and far fewer pictures like this that have been scraped by the AI. But there are far many more people who engage in this kind of action. And I think that doesn't just point to the limitation of Midjourney, but Midjourney reflects the limitations of our imaginations. If we are interested in, again, a terrain of compromise that stops the inflammation in our bodies, that actually redistributes knowledge in the public domain in a way that recognizes indigenous knowledge, that recognizes peasant knowledge, and recognizes the necessity of transforming access to land and to capital in a way that democratizes, then we will need to acknowledge that our AI overlords are not really in the best place to do that. And I just want to end by just encouraging you, if you find any of this interesting, first of all, I want to thank the originators of the images that I've used, but also some of the literature that I've been drawing on. And finally, I want to thank you very much indeed for your attention. I'm looking forward to the Q&A.